She was already shaking when the menu hit the table because $15 wasn't enough and she knew it. Then the diner went dead silent, not from fear of hunger, but because a mafia boss had just walked in. And when he heard why her husband died and who took everything she owned, he didn't order food. He decided who wouldn't survive the night. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. Juliana Molina had forgotten what safety felt like. 6 months ago, she knew exactly where she belonged. In a small house on Maple Street, with faded blue shutters and a front porch that creaked when you stepped on it. In a warm bed next to her husband, listening to him breathe in the dark. In a life that wasn't perfect, but was hers. Now she had nothing. No house, no savings, no husband. Just 2 little girls who still believed their mother could protect them. She sat in the corner booth of the diner, her olive green jacket still zipped up to her throat even though the heat inside made her skin prickle with sweat. She couldn't take it off. Beneath it, her shirt was threadbare and stained. She couldn't let anyone see. Chloe sat, pressed against her left side, her small hands folded in her lap. Palmer sat on her right, staring at the menu Juliana held with trembling fingers. Both girls wore thin beige sweaters that had once been soft, but were now pilled and worn at the elbows. Their blonde hair hung limp and uncombed. Their faces were pale, their eyes too wide, too watchful for children so young. They had learned not to ask for things. They had learned that Mama's tears meant danger. Juliana's eyes moved across the laminated menu, but the words blurred together. Her vision kept tunneling, her breath catching in her chest. She counted the prices over and over, trying to make the math work. 15 yuan. That was all she had. She could order 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, split them between Chloe and Palmer. Maybe get them each a small milk. That would leave her with $1 or $2 for a tip if she was lucky. She wouldn't eat. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. Now it just ached, a dull and constant pain she had learned to ignore. The waitress appeared beside the table, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She pulled a notepad from her apron pocket and clicked her pen. "What can I get you, hun?" Juliana's throat tightened. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The waitress waited. Chloe looked up at her mother. Palmer's small hand reached over and touched Juliana's arm. "Mama?" Juliana forced herself to speak. Her voice came out thin and shaky. Two grilled cheese sandwiches, please. And 2 small milks." The waitress scribbled it down without looking up. "Anything for you?" "No. Just them." The waitress paused. Her eyes flicked to Juliana's face, pale, exhausted, bruised beneath the eyes from sleepless nights. Then to the twins, their small bodies pressed close to their mother like frightened animals. For a moment, something softened in the woman's expression, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded and walked away. Juliana exhaled slowly, her hands still gripping the edge of the menu. She set it down carefully, as if it might shatter. Chloe leaned closer. "Mama, are we going home tonight?" Juliana's chest tightened. Home. They didn't have a home. They had been staying in a rundown motel on the edge of town for the past 3 weeks. The kind of place where the carpet smelled like mildew and the heater rattled all night. She had paid for 2 more nights with the last of the money she'd scraped together cleaning houses for cash. After that, she didn't know what they would do. "We'll figure it out, baby," Juliana whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face. "We always do." But even as she said it, her eyes drifted back to the door. Not in hope. In fear. Because the men who had taken everything from her, who had stood in her living room and stripped it bare while her daughters cried, were still out there. And they had made it very clear. They would keep coming until she paid what her husband owed. Except she had nothing left to give. Her husband, David, had died 6 months ago. A heart attack at 34. Sudden. Brutal. Final. She found out 2 weeks later that he had borrowed money. A lot of money. From men who didn't work through banks or lawyers. Men who didn't care about widows or children or sob stories. She tried to reason with them, begged them to let her pay in installments, told them she would work, sell everything, do whatever it took. They refused. "Debt doesn't die with a man," one of them had said, his voice cold and flat. "And we don't do mercy." They took the house, the furniture, David's tools, even his clothes. And when Juliana asked what would happen if she couldn't pay, the man had leaned in close and smiled. "Then we take something else." She understood what he meant. So she ran, took the twins and whatever cash she could hide and disappeared into the cold. But she knew they were still looking. She could feel it like eyes on the back of her neck, like shadows that moved when she wasn't looking. She couldn't stay anywhere long, couldn't make friends, couldn't trust anyone. All she could do was survive one more day. The diner door swung open again. Juliana's head snapped up, her body going rigid. But it was just an older couple, bundled in coats and scarves, laughing as they shook snow from their shoulders. She exhaled shakily and looked down at her hands. They were trembling, Chloe noticed. She slipped her small hand into Juliana's and squeezed. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. Juliana's throat burned. She squeezed back, unable to speak. The food arrived a few minutes later. 2 golden grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles, 2 small glasses of milk with straws. The twins' eyes lit up. Juliana's heart cracked. "Go ahead, babies," she whispered. "Eat." Chloe and Palmer didn't need to be told twice. They picked up the sandwiches with both hands and bit into them eagerly, cheese stretching between their small fingers. Juliana watched them, her vision blurring again. This was all she had left. This moment, this booth, these 2 little girls who still believed she could save them. And then, the door opened. A blast of cold air swept through the diner, and everything stopped. The man who stepped inside was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that looked like it cost more than Juliana had earned in a year. His long dark hair was slicked back from a face that was all hard angles and cold control. Tattoos snaked up from beneath his collar, dark ink that spoke of violence and power. Behind him, 4 other men entered, silent, watchful, all in black. The diner fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Juliana's breath caught in her throat. She knew that silence. She had heard it before in her living room, when the men came to take everything. And now, on Christmas Eve, with nowhere left to run, one of them had just walked in. Adriano Silva didn't need to announce himself. His presence did it for him. He stood just inside the doorway, snow melting on the shoulders of his black suit, his dark eyes scanning the room with the calm precision of a predator assessing territory. Behind him, his 4 men fanned out slightly, not aggressive, not threatening, just there. Silent sentinels who understood that their boss never needed backup, only witnesses. The diner had gone completely still. A fork hovered halfway to an elderly man's mouth. A young couple froze mid-conversation, their coffee cups suspended in the air. Even the waitress who had been refilling water glasses stood motionless, pitcher tilted but not pouring. No one looked directly at Adriano, but everyone was watching. Juliana felt her lungs constrict. Her hand instinctively moved to cover Chloe's, pressing her daughter's small fingers against the table. Palmer stopped chewing mid-bite, her eyes wide and confused. "Mama?" Palmer whispered. "Shh." Juliana breathed, so quietly it was almost soundless. "Don't move." She knew this silence. She had lived through it before, the moment when dangerous men entered a room and sucked all the air out of it. The moment when ordinary people became invisible, irrelevant, nothing more than furniture that happened to have a heartbeat. Her stomach twisted into knots. "Please don't let them be looking for me. Please. Not here. Not in front of my girls." Adriano's gaze moved methodically across the diner. He noted the elderly couple in the corner, the young family near the window, the lone trucker at the counter nursing black coffee. His eyes passed over each person with the same measured attention, cataloging, assessing, dismissing. And then his gaze landed on Juliana. She felt it like a physical weight. Her breath stopped entirely. For 3 long seconds, Adriano Silva looked at the woman in the worn olive jacket, her blonde hair falling limply around a face marked by exhaustion and fear. He saw the 2 small girls pressed against her sides like baby birds sheltering under a broken wing. He saw the half-eaten grilled cheese sandwiches, the 2 small glasses of milk. He saw the empty space in front of her where a meal should have been, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something cold and calculating clicked into place. Then he looked away. Juliana felt lightheaded with relief. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her knuckles white. Adriano moved deeper into the diner, his men following at a respectful distance. He chose a booth near the back, not the farthest corner, but close enough to see everything, close enough to hear everything. One of his men slid into the booth across from him. The other 3 remained standing, positioned at strategic points throughout the small space. Not blocking exits, not hovering, just present. The diner slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Forks clinked against plates. The waitress moved again, though her hands shook slightly as she approached Adriano's table. Coffee, Adriano said before she could speak. His voice was low, quiet, but it carried. Black. And whatever she's having? He gestured toward the waitress herself. The woman blinked, confused. I'm sorry? You haven't taken a break tonight. It wasn't a question. Order yourself something. I'm paying. The waitress stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Adriano's expression didn't change. That wasn't optional. Thank you, she stammered, then hurried away before he could say anything else. Juliana forced herself to look down at her daughters. Chloe had started eating again, though her movements were mechanical, nervous. Palmer was still staring at the men in black, her sandwich forgotten in her small hands. Palmer, Juliana whispered, gently turning her daughter's face toward her. Eat, baby. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. Because from his booth across the diner, Adriano Silva was watching them again. Not openly, not obviously, but Juliana could feel it. She had developed instincts over the past 6 months, survival instincts that screamed when danger was near. And right now, every nerve in her body was on fire. She watched from the corner of her eye as Adriano lifted his coffee cup black, no sugar, exactly as he'd ordered, and took a slow sip. His eyes never stopped moving. He noticed when the young couple paid their bill and left too quickly. He noticed when the trucker glanced at him in the counter's reflection. He noticed when the elderly man whispered something to his wife, and she gripped his hand tighter. Fear had a smell, and Adriano Silva had learned long ago to recognize it. But something else caught his attention. The woman in the olive jacket. She had barely moved since he entered. Her body was angled protectively around her children. Her shoulders were hunched forward, as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. And her eyes, those exhausted, frightened eyes, kept flicking toward the door. Not toward him. Toward the door. Like she was expecting someone else. Adriano set his coffee cup down carefully. He had seen that look before. Many times. It was the look of someone being hunted. The look of someone who knew that safety was an illusion, and that at any moment, the door could open, and their worst nightmare could walk through it. He leaned back slightly in his booth, his fingers drumming once against the table, a subtle signal. One of his men, a broad-shouldered enforcer named Rico, stepped closer. Boss? Adriano didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Juliana's table. The woman, corner booth. You see her? Rico glanced over. Yeah, she's afraid. Everyone's afraid when you walk in, boss. No, Adriano's voice dropped lower. She was afraid before I got here. Rico said nothing, waiting. Adriano watched as Juliana reached into her jacket pocket and touched something, her fingers closing around it, checking, reassuring herself it was still there. The gesture was unconscious, compulsive. He'd seen that before too. People who counted money obsessively did it for one of two reasons. They were desperately poor, or they were desperately in debt. Sometimes both. She ordered food for the kids. Adriano said quietly. Nothing for herself. Maybe she's not hungry. She's starving. Adriano's jaw tightened. Look at her hands. Look at her face. She hasn't eaten in days. Rico shifted his weight. You want me to? No. Adriano cut him off. Not yet, but he didn't look away. Because Adriano Silva hadn't built an empire by ignoring his instincts. And right now, his instincts were screaming that the terrified woman in the corner booth wasn't just poor. She was running. And whoever she was running from. They were the kind of men Adriano knew very, very well. Juliana could feel his eyes on her. She didn't know how she knew she wasn't looking at him. Hadn't looked at him since that first terrible moment when their eyes met, but she could feel it. The weight of his attention pressed against her like a hand on her shoulder. Her fingers trembled as she reached for Palmer's milk glass, steadying it before her daughter could knock it over. Careful, baby, she whispered. Chloe had finished her sandwich. She sat quietly now, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Palmer was still eating, but slowly, her chewing mechanical and drowsy. They needed sleep. They needed a warm bed and safety and all the things Juliana couldn't give them. She glanced at the check the waitress had left face down on the table. Her stomach twisted. She didn't want to look. Didn't want to see the number that would tell her whether she'd calculated correctly, or whether she'd have to do the worst thing imaginable, send food back, ask them to split one meal instead of two, beg for mercy from strangers. Her hand shook as she reached for it. Don't. The voice came from directly beside her. Juliana's head snapped up, her heart lurching into her throat. Adriano Silva stood next to the booth, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Up close, he was even more imposing, taller, broader, his presence somehow filling all the available space. The tattoos on his neck were intricate, deliberate, the kind that meant something, the kind that told a story written in ink and violence. Juliana's mouth went dry. She couldn't form words. I'm sorry, Don't touch the check, Adriano said quietly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Juliana pulled her hand back as if the check had burned her. I wasn't. She was babbling. She couldn't stop. Chloe and Palmer pressed closer to their mother, their small faces tilted up toward the tall man in the black suit. Chloe's bottom lip trembled. Palmer's eyes were wide with confusion and fear. Adriano's gaze shifted to the twins, and something flickered across his face, something too quick to name. Then his eyes returned to Juliana. Where is your husband? The question hit Juliana like a fist to the chest. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. He's... Her throat closed up entirely. Adriano waited. He didn't repeat the question, didn't rush her, just stood there with infinite patience, his dark eyes steady and unblinking. Juliana felt tears burning behind her eyes. She tried to swallow them down, tried to hold herself together, but the words came out broken and raw. He's gone. Silence. He died, she whispered. 6 months ago. The diner seemed to fade away. The other voices, the clinking dishes, the Christmas music playing softly from a radio somewhere. It all became background noise, distant and unimportant. Adriano's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How old are they? He gestured toward the twins. 5. Juliana's voice cracked. They just turned 5. Adriano looked at Chloe and Palmer again. Really looked at them this time. 2 little girls with blonde hair and frightened eyes, wearing sweaters that were too thin for winter, sitting in a diner on Christmas Eve with a mother who couldn't afford to feed herself. His hands, still in his pockets, curled into fists. What happened to him? Adriano asked, his voice quieter now. Heart attack. Juliana wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. The doctors said, they said it was sudden, that he didn't suffer. But you did. It wasn't a question. Juliana's breath hitched. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Adriano pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking permission. His men remained at a distance, watching but not interfering. Up close, Juliana could see the details. The darkness had hidden the scar through his left eyebrow, the silver ring on his right hand, the way his eyes weren't just dark but seemed to see straight through her. Tell me what happened after he died, Adriano said. It wasn't a request. Juliana's hands twisted together in her lap. I can't. I shouldn't. Tell me. And something in his voice, some undercurrent of authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with power, broke through her resistance. The words came spilling out. David, my husband, he borrowed money. Her voice was barely above a whisper. For a business, a delivery truck. He wanted to start his own company. He said it would change everything for us. Give the girls a better life. She paused, her breath shuddering. He borrowed from men, not a bank. Men who... I know the kind, Adriano said flatly. Juliana nodded, tears streaming down her face now. After he died, they came. 2 weeks later. I didn't even know about the debt. David never told me, and they didn't care. They didn't care that he was dead. They didn't care about Chloe and Palmer. They just wanted their money. Her voice rose, edged with hysteria. I begged them. I told them I would pay. I would get a job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever it took. I asked if I could pay in installments. Just give me time, please. What did they say? Juliana's face crumpled. They said debt doesn't die with a man. Her voice dropped to a broken whisper. They said they don't accept mercy. Adriano's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. They took everything, Juliana continued, the words pouring out now like blood from a wound. The house, the furniture, David's tools, his clothes, things that belonged to him, to us, to our family. They took it all. And when I asked what would happen if I couldn't pay the rest, one of them... She stopped, her whole body shaking. One of them what? Adriano's voice had gone dangerously quiet. He smiled. Juliana looked up at Adriano with haunted eyes. He smiled and said they'd take something else. And then he looked at my daughters. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Adriano didn't move, didn't speak, but something changed in his eyes, something cold and lethal and absolutely merciless. Names, he said softly. What? Give me their names. Juliana's eyes widened. I can't. If they find out They won't. Adriano leaned forward slightly. Names. And before Juliana could stop herself, before her survival instincts could scream at her to stay silent, she whispered 2 names into the space between them. Names that meant nothing to her, but meant everything to Adriano Silva. Because they were names he recognized. Men who operated in his world. Men who had forgotten the rules. Men who had just made a fatal mistake. Gregor and Tommy. Juliana whispered, her voice barely audible. Gregor. I don't know his last name, but Tommy Rizzuto. The moment the names left her lips, she regretted it. Adriano's expression didn't change. Not a flicker, not a twitch. But the air around him seemed to thicken, to grow heavy with something dark and suffocating. One of his men, the one called Rico, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Another exchanged a glance with the man beside him. Silent communication that Juliana didn't understand but felt in her bones. They knew those names. They came 3 times, Juliana continued, unable to stop now that she'd started. The first time was 2 weeks after the funeral. They were polite, almost. They said David owed them $43,000. They wanted it all, immediately. Her hands twisted together so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't have it. I had $300 in our checking account. David's life insurance wouldn't pay out for months because they had to investigate. I showed them the bank statements, the bills. I showed them everything. I begged them to wait. And Adriano's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. But Juliana could hear something beneath it. Something that made her throat tighten. They said they'd come back in 1 week. When they did, they brought a truck. Her voice cracked. They took our couch, our dining table, the TV, David's tools from the garage. He was so proud of those tools. They took the girls' bunk beds while Chloe and Palmer watched. A tear slid down her cheek. The 3rd time, they brought papers. Legal papers. They said the house was collateral, that David had signed it over. I didn't even know. He never told me he'd put our home up as... She couldn't finish. Adriano's fingers drummed once against the table. A single, deliberate tap. How much do you still owe? Juliana's laugh was bitter and broken. Everything. They took the house, but they said it wasn't enough. That David had borrowed more than they'd gotten back. They said I still owe $28,000. For a truck loan. For a truck that was repossessed a week after David died. Juliana's voice rose with the injustice of it. They took the truck. They took the house. They took everything we owned. And they still say I owe them. Adriano leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When did they come last? 4 days ago. Juliana's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. They found the motel where we were staying. I don't know how. I'd been so careful. But Tommy knocked on the door at 2 a.m. He didn't threaten me. He didn't have to. He just stood there and said, "We know where you are now. We'll always know." Her whole body trembled. I packed everything in 10 minutes. We left that night. We've been moving every day since. Sleeping in the car, staying at shelters when we can. I can't let them find us again. Chloe made a small sound, a whimper she tried to swallow. Palmer buried her face against her mother's arm. Adriano's gaze shifted to the twins. And for a moment, just a moment, something human flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone. These men, Adriano said carefully. Gregor and Tommy. Did they say who they work for? Juliana shook her head. No. They just said... They said they were collecting what was owed. That they had a right to it. They don't. The words were spoken so quietly. Juliana almost missed them. What? Adriano's eyes locked onto hers. They don't have a right. Not to your home. Not to your husband's belongings. And sure as hell not to terrorize a widow and her children. Juliana stared at him, confusion and hope warring in her chest. I don't understand. How do you... Because men like that operate under rules. Adriano's voice was cold now, precise. And they've broken every single one. He reached into his jacket. Juliana flinched instinctively and pulled out a leather wallet. He opened it, extracted several bills without counting them, and placed them on the table. $300. Juliana's eyes widened. I can't take... It's not for you. Adriano pushed the money toward her. It's for them. He gestured to Chloe and Palmer. Buy them real coats, real clothes, a safe place to sleep tonight. But Adriano picked up the check the waitress had left. He glanced at it, $14.76, and pulled out another $50 bill. He placed both the check and the money at the edge of the table where the waitress could see it. Then he reached across and gently pushed Juliana's crumpled $15 bill back toward her. "Keep it," he said simply. Juliana's hands flew to her mouth. A sob broke free, raw and desperate, and filled with 6 months of terror and exhaustion. "Why?" she choked out. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Adriano stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with precise movements. "Because I know what it's like to watch your mother go hungry so you can eat," he said quietly. "And I know what men like Gregor and Tommy are. I know exactly what they are." He looked down at her, and Juliana saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, understanding. "They won't come for you again," Adriano said. Juliana's voice trembled. "How? How do you know?" Adriano leaned down slightly, his voice dropping so low only she could hear it. "Because men like that only survive as long as I allow them to." Juliana's blood turned to ice. Not from fear, from realization. She understood what he was, who he was, what those names had meant to him. Don't say it," Adriano straightened. "Just take your daughters somewhere safe tonight. Get them warm, feed them again. And tomorrow," he paused. "Tomorrow, I'll make sure you never have to run again." Before Juliana could respond, Adriano turned and walked toward the door. His men fell into formation behind him, silent shadows moving in perfect synchronization. But just before he reached the exit, Adriano stopped. He turned his head slightly, not looking back but listening. "One more thing," he called across the diner. Juliana's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes? Where are you staying tonight?" I don't know yet. I was going to find the Riverside Inn, 3 blocks north." Adriano's tone left no room for argument. "Room 212. It's been paid for. 1 week. No questions asked." "I can't." "You can." Adriano's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "And you will. For them." Then he pushed open the door and stepped out into the snow. The diner remained silent for a long moment after he left. Then, slowly, conversation resumed. Dishes clinked. The Christmas music played on. But Juliana sat frozen in her booth, staring at the $300 on the table and the $15 he'd returned to her. Outside, through the frosted window, she could see Adriano standing beside a black car, speaking quietly into a phone. His expression was calm, but his eyes promised vengeance. Juliana couldn't move. She sat in the booth, staring at the money on the table like it might vanish if she blinked. $300. More money than she'd held in her hands since before David died. More than enough to feed her daughters for weeks. More than enough to... "Mama?" Chloe's small voice pulled her back. Juliana looked down to find both twins staring up at her with wide, confused eyes. Palmer's hand was still gripping her arm. Chloe's bottom lip trembled. "Is the scary man gone?" Palmer whispered. Juliana opened her mouth to say yes, but the word caught in her throat. Was he scary? Yes. Absolutely. Terrifyingly so. But he'd also just given them more than anyone else had in 6 months. "He's gone, baby," Juliana finally managed. "He's not going to hurt us." "Are you sure?" Chloe asked, her voice so small it broke Juliana's heart. Juliana pulled both girls close, pressing kisses to the tops of their heads. "I'm sure." But even as she said it, her eyes drifted back to the window. Adriano was still outside, standing beside a sleek black car, his phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, even through the frosted glass, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the cold fury in his posture. He was making calls, and Juliana knew somehow, instinctively, that those calls had to do with Gregor and Tommy. A chill ran down her spine. Not from fear. From something else. Something she couldn't name. Hope? No. Hope was too dangerous. But maybe possibility. The waitress approached the table hesitantly, her eyes darting between Juliana and the money. She picked up the $50 bill and the check, then paused. "He's generous," she said carefully, as if testing the word. Juliana didn't know how to respond. The waitress looked at the twins, then back at Juliana. Her expression softened. "You know what? Those grilled cheese sandwiches looked a little small. How about I bring out some fries? Maybe some hot chocolate for the girls?" "I can't," Juliana started. "On the house." The waitress's voice was firm. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should go hungry on Christmas Eve." Before Juliana could protest, the woman turned and walked away. Chloe and Palmer exchanged glances, their eyes lighting up for the first time all night. "Hot chocolate?" Palmer breathed. like the words were magic. "And fries?" Chloe added. Juliana felt tears burning again. She blinked them back furiously. "Yes, babies. Hot chocolate and fries." The twins smiled real smiles, not the frightened, uncertain ones they'd worn for months, and Juliana felt something crack open inside her chest. When was the last time she'd seen them smile like that? 10 minutes later, the table was covered with food. A heaping basket of golden fries, 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and chocolate shavings, and because the waitress apparently couldn't help herself, 3 slices of apple pie still warm from the oven. "For all of you," the waitress said pointedly, setting a fork in front of Juliana. "And I don't want to see that fork untouched when I come back." Juliana stared at the pie, her stomach twisting with hunger and guilt in equal measure. "Mama, you have to eat," Chloe said seriously. "The lady said so." "Yeah, Mama," Palmer echoed, already dipping a fry into ketchup. "You have to." Juliana looked at her daughters, their faces flushed with warmth now, their eyes bright, their small hands reaching eagerly for food they didn't have to ration or worry about, and she picked up the fork. The first bite of apple pie was almost painful. Her stomach, unused to real food, cramped in protest. But she forced herself to swallow, then took another bite, and another. Chloe and Palmer watched her eat, relief evident on their small faces. "You're not going to disappear, Mama," Chloe said softly. Juliana's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "What?" "You kept getting lighter," Palmer added, her voice matter of fact. "Like you might blow away." Juliana's throat closed up entirely. God. They'd noticed. Of course they'd noticed. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered fiercely. "I promise. I'm right here." The twins nodded, satisfied, and returned to their fries and hot chocolate. But Juliana couldn't stop the tears that slid down her cheeks as she ate. Across the diner, near the back, a few patrons watched the scene unfold. An elderly woman leaned toward her husband. "That's the table he stopped at," she whispered. "The man in the black suit." Her husband nodded slowly. "I saw. Why do you think he helped them?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because men like that remember what it's like to be hungry, and they never forget." His wife looked back at Juliana and the twins, then at the money still sitting on the table. "I hope she takes it," she murmured. "I hope she doesn't let pride get in the way." "She won't," her husband said with certainty. "She's got babies. Pride doesn't feed babies." Outside, Adriano ended his call and stood in the falling snow, staring at nothing. Rico approached cautiously. "Boss?" "Gregor Petrov and Tommy Rizzuto," Adriano said, his voice flat and emotionless. "They've been collecting without authorization, running their own side operation, taking cuts that don't belong to them." Rico's jaw tightened. "How long?" "At least a year, maybe longer." Adriano's hands curled into fists. "They've been targeting widows, single mothers, people who can't fight back, people who don't know any better." "Jesus. They're using our name," Adriano continued, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Telling people they work for me, that the debts are sanctioned." Rico's expression darkened. "They're dead men." "Not yet." Adriano turned to face him fully. "First I want to know who else is involved. Who's been looking the other way? Who's been taking payments? And then," Adriano's smile was cold and terrible, "then we remind everyone why rules exist." Rico nodded once. "What about the woman, Juliana?" Adriano glanced back through the diner window. He could see Juliana eating slowly, her daughters laughing over their hot chocolate. For the first time since he'd walked in, her shoulders weren't hunched in fear. "She stays protected," Adriano said quietly. "Around the clock. I don't care if she knows about it or not. No one touches her. No one goes near those children." "For how long?" "For as long as it takes." Adriano's voice was final. "Until Gregor and Tommy are handled. Until every debt collector in this city knows what happens when you break the rules." Rico hesitated. "Boss, she's got kids. If this blows back, it won't." Adriano's eyes were cold and certain, because Gregor and Tommy won't live long enough to retaliate. He pulled out his phone again and made another call. It was answered on the first ring. "It's me," Adriano said. "I need everything on Gregor Petrov and Tommy Rizzuto. Every debt they've collected, every widow they've terrorized, every dollar they've stolen." He paused. "And I need it by morning." He ended the call and stood in the snow, watching as Juliana carefully folded the $300 and tucked it into her jacket pocket. She looked up suddenly, her eyes finding him through the window. For a moment, They just stared at each other. Then Juliana mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Adriano nodded once. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. Juliana gathered her daughters close as they left the diner, the warmth of the meal still radiating through their small bodies. The snow had picked up, falling thicker now, coating the sidewalks in white. Christmas lights blurred through the flakes like watercolor paintings. Chloe held her mother's hand tightly. Palmer clutched the paper bag the waitress had pressed into Juliana's hands, leftover pie, wrapped carefully. "For breakfast tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word felt strange, foreign. For 6 months, Juliana had only thought in terms of hours. The next hour, the next meal, the next place to hide. But now, with $300 in her pocket and a hotel room waiting 3 blocks north, tomorrow felt almost possible. She pulled her jacket tighter and started walking. The street was quiet. Most families were home now, gathered around Christmas trees, exchanging gifts, singing carols. Juliana tried not to think about what that felt like. Tried not to remember last Christmas David alive, the house warm, presents under the tree. "Stop it," she told herself. "Just keep walking." They made it 2 blocks before Juliana felt it, the sensation of being watched. Her steps slowed. Her grip on Chloe's hand tightened instinctively. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Just empty sidewalks and falling snow. But the feeling didn't go away. She kept walking. Faster now, scanning every shadow, every parked car, every darkened doorway. "Mama?" Chloe's voice was small. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, baby. We're almost there." But her heart was racing. They turned the corner onto Riverside Avenue, and Juliana spotted the inn, a modest 2-story building with a glowing neon sign that read, "Vacancy," in red letters. Relief flooded through her. Almost there, just a few more steps, and then a car door opened behind them. Juliana froze. Her blood turned to ice as she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Heavy, deliberate, getting closer. No, not now. Not when we're so close. She spun around, pulling Chloe and Palmer behind her, ready to run, to scream, to fight if she had to. A man stepped into the glow of a streetlight. Tall, black coat, dark skin, built like he could break someone in half without trying. Juliana recognized him immediately. One of Adriano's men. "Mrs. Molina." His voice was calm, measured. "My name is Rico. I work for Mr. Silva." Juliana's breath came in short gasps. "What do you want?" Rico held up both hands, showing he was unarmed. "Mr. Silva asked me to make sure you got to the inn safely." What? "You're being watched," Rico said simply. "Not by us, by them." Juliana's stomach dropped. "Gregor and Tommy?" Rico's expression darkened. "Not them personally, but they've got people. Eyes on the street. Mr. Silva wants to make sure they don't get anywhere near you or your daughters." Juliana looked past Rico to the black sedan idling at the curb, its windows tinted, its engine purring softly. "How long have you been following us?" she whispered. "Since you left the diner." Rico's tone wasn't apologetic. "And we'll keep following until this is handled." Juliana didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't know how to ask what Adriano was planning to do. Rico seemed to understand anyway. "Mr. Silva takes care of his own problems. That's all you need to know." He gestured toward the inn. "Go inside. Check in. Room 212. Everything's already arranged. Tomorrow morning, there'll be someone outside your door. You won't see them, but they'll be there. For how long?" "As long as it takes." Juliana stared at him, trying to process what was happening. "Why is he doing this? We're nothing to him. You reminded him of something," Rico interrupted quietly. "Something he tries very hard to forget." Before Juliana could ask what that meant, Rico nodded once and walked back to the sedan. The car pulled away silently, disappearing into the snowy night. Juliana stood on the sidewalk, her daughters pressed against her sides, watching the taillights fade. "Mama?" Palmer tugged on her jacket. "Can we go inside now? I'm cold." Juliana looked down at her girls, their tired faces, their hopeful eyes, and made a decision. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Let's go inside." Room 212 was small but clean. 2 double beds with thick comforters, a bathroom with hot water, a heater that actually worked, a TV mounted on the wall. To Juliana, it looked like a palace. Chloe and Palmer ran straight to the beds, bouncing on them experimentally, their laughter bright and clear. "Mama, come feel how soft they are." Juliana stood in the doorway, her throat tight with emotion. When was the last time they'd slept in real beds? Weeks? Months? She closed the door behind her and locked it, the deadbolt, the chain, everything. Then she walked to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. The street below was quiet, empty, but she knew they were out there. Adriano's men, watching, protecting. And somewhere else in the city, Adriano himself was making calls, moving pieces on a chessboard Juliana couldn't see, doing things she probably didn't want to know about. For her, for Chloe and Palmer. She let the curtain fall back into place. An hour later, both girls were asleep, curled together in one bed, their small bodies finally relaxed, finally safe. Juliana sat on the edge of the other bed, staring at the $300 spread out on the nightstand. Real money, real safety, real hope. But it came from a man who lived in a world of violence and fear. A man who, with a single phone call, could make people disappear. Juliana knew she should be terrified, should pack up her daughters right now and run as far and as fast as she could. But she didn't. Because for the first time in 6 months, Chloe and Palmer were sleeping without fear. For the first time in 6 months, Juliana wasn't listening for footsteps in the hallway or looking over her shoulder every 5 seconds. For the first time in 6 months, they were safe. And that safety came with a price paid by Adriano Silva. In blood, probably. Juliana closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet room. I'm sorry. Sorry for whatever was about to happen. Sorry for the violence she knew was coming. Sorry that her desperation had pulled a man like Adriano Silva into her life. But not sorry enough to walk away. Because her daughters were sleeping. And that was worth more than her conscience. Across the city, in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil and old concrete, Adriano Silva stood in front of 2 men tied to chairs. Gregor Petrov, Tommy Rizzuto. They'd been easy to find. Too easy. Sloppy men who thought they were untouchable. Adriano walked slowly around them, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. $43,000, he said quietly. That's what you told Juliana Molina her dead husband owed you. Gregor's eye was already swelling shut. Tommy's nose was broken. Neither of them spoke. Here's what's interesting, Adriano continued, his voice conversational. I checked. David Molina borrowed $8,000. The truck you repossessed? Worth $12,000. The house you took? Worth $90,000. He stopped directly in front of them. So by my math, you didn't just collect a debt. You stole from a widow and her children. And then you had the audacity to tell her she still owed you money. Tommy spat blood onto the concrete floor. We were just operating without authorization, Adriano finished. Using my name. Terrorizing women and children. He leaned down until his face was level with Tommy's. You broke the rules, Adriano said softly. And rules exist for a reason. Gregor finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Silva, please. We didn't know she was under my protection? Adriano straightened. She is now. And so is every other widow you've terrorized. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Bring in the files, he said simply. A moment later, Rico entered carrying a thick folder. Adriano opened it. Page after page of names, addresses, amounts collected. All widows, all single mothers, all victims of Gregor and Tommy's greed. You're going to pay back every single dollar, Adriano said. With interest. And then, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. Then we're going to have a conversation about consequences. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of snow falling against the metal roof. And outside, in a warm hotel room, Juliana Molina slept peacefully for the first time in 6 months. Morning light filtered through the hotel curtains, soft and golden. Juliana woke slowly, confused for a moment about where she was. Then she felt the softness beneath her, a real mattress, clean sheets, warmth, and remembered. The diner, Adriano Silva, the $300. Room 212. She sat up carefully, not wanting to wake the twins. Chloe and Palmer were still curled together in the other bed, their faces peaceful, their breathing deep and even. They'd slept through the entire night without waking once. No nightmares, no crying, no trembling in their sleep. Juliana's chest tightened with emotion. She stood quietly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside. The street was quiet. A few cars passed. A man walked his dog. Everything looked normal. But Juliana knew better now. Somewhere out there, Adriano's men were watching, protecting. She let the curtain fall and turned toward the bathroom. A hot shower. When was the last time she'd had a hot shower? 20 minutes later, she emerged feeling almost human again. Her hair was clean, her skin warm, her muscles relaxed for the first time in months. She found clean clothes in her bag, wrinkled but serviceable, and dressed quietly. The twins were stirring now, their small bodies stretching, their eyes blinking open. "Mama?" Chloe's voice was sleepy and soft. "I'm here, baby." Palmer sat up, looking around in confusion. "Where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Juliana said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Somewhere warm." She helped them wash up and dress, her movements automatic, maternal. But her mind was elsewhere. What happened last night? What did Adriano do? She pushed the thoughts away. She didn't want to know. Couldn't afford to know. A knock on the door made her freeze. Chloe and Palmer went silent immediately, their bodies tensing. Juliana's heart hammered as she approached the door. She looked through the peephole. Rico stood in the hallway, holding a paper bag and a cardboard drink carrier. Juliana exhaled shakily and opened the door, keeping the chain on. "Mrs. Molina," Rico's voice was respectful. "Mr. Silva asked me to bring you breakfast." He held up the bag. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted through the crack in the door. Juliana's stomach growled traitorously. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you." Rico set the items down outside the door. "There's also this." He placed a thick manila envelope on top of the bag. Juliana stared at it. "What is that?" "Information," Rico said simply. "And instructions. Mr. Silva will explain everything when he arrives." Juliana's eyes widened. "He's coming here?" "In about an hour." Rico's expression was unreadable. "He wants to speak with you." Before Juliana could respond, Rico turned and walked down the hallway. Juliana waited until he disappeared around the corner, then quickly gathered the bag, the drinks, and the envelope. She closed the door and locked it again. Chloe and Palmer were watching her with wide eyes. "Who is that?" Palmer asked. "A friend," Juliana said, not knowing what else to call him. "He brought us breakfast." The twins' faces lit up. Inside the bag were fresh croissants, fruit cups, yogurt, and orange juice. Real food, good food. They ate together on one of the beds, the TV playing cartoons softly in the background. Chloe and Palmer chatted happily about the shows, about the soft beds, about how warm the room was. Normal conversation. Childhood conversation. Juliana felt tears prickling again, but blinked them back. After they finished eating, she picked up the manila envelope with trembling hands. Inside were documents. Legal documents. The first page made her breath catch. Debt. Cancellation notice. This document certifies that all debts attributed to David Molina, deceased, are hereby declared null and void. No further collection attempts will be made against Juliana Molina or her dependents. Signed, Adriano Silva. On behalf of Silva Enterprises. Juliana's hands shook as she flipped through the other pages. Bank statements showing the original loan, $8,000. Receipts for the repossessed truck, valued at $12,000. Documentation of the house seizure, valued at $90,000. And a final page, a calculation showing that Gregor and Tommy had not only collected the debt in full but had profited by nearly $60,000. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was a note. "You owed nothing. You were stolen from. This has been corrected." Juliana pressed her hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. An hour later, there was another knock. Juliana had been expecting it, but her hands still shook as she opened the door. Adriano Silva stood in the hallway, dressed in a different suit, charcoal gray this time, perfectly tailored. He looked exactly as he had the night before, powerful, controlled, dangerous. But his eyes were softer somehow, tired. "Mrs. Molina," he said quietly. "May I come in?" Juliana glanced back at the twins, who were watching cartoons, then nodded and stepped aside. Adriano entered, his presence immediately filling the small room. He glanced at Chloe and Palmer, and something flickered across his face, something almost gentle. "Girls," he said, his voice surprisingly warm, "would you like to watch your shows for a little while? Your mama and I need to talk." The twins looked at Juliana, who nodded. Adriano waited until they were distracted again, then turned to face Juliana fully. "You read the documents." It wasn't a question. Juliana nodded, unable to find her voice. "Then you know you're free," Adriano said. "The debt is cancelled. Gregor and Tommy won't be bothering you again. Ever. What did you do to them?" The question escaped before Juliana could stop it. Adriano's expression didn't change. "I corrected a mistake." "Did you kill them?" "No." His voice was flat. "But I made sure they understood the consequences of their actions. They'll be repaying every widow they stole from. With interest." And if they ever step out of line again. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Juliana swallowed hard. Why are you doing this? You don't owe us anything. Adriano was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, When I was 7 years old, my mother was widowed. My father was killed in a construction accident. And men who said my father owed them money. They took everything we had. Our furniture, our food. They would have taken our home if my mother hadn't. He stopped, his jaw tightening. She did things no mother should have to do to keep us safe. And I swore that when I had power I would never let that happen to another woman, another child. Juliana's throat burned. So this is… what? Redemption? No. Adriano's voice was firm. This is correction. Men like Gregor and Tommy exist because no one stops them. Because people look the other way. I don't look away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. If anyone ever threatens you again, anyone you call that number, day or night, and someone will come. Juliana took the card with shaking hands. I can't be in debt to you. I can't owe. You don't owe me anything, Adriano interrupted. A mother protecting her children is never a burden. It's the most important thing in the world. His eyes held hers, intense and unwavering. You're not charity, Mrs. Molina. You're not a debt. You're someone who deserves to live without fear. And I'm someone who has the power to make that happen. Juliana felt tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me. Adriana's voice was quiet. Just take care of your daughters. Give them the life they deserve. That's all the thanks I need. He turned toward the door, then paused. The room is paid for 2 weeks. After that, there's an apartment waiting. First and last month's rent covered. It's in a safe neighborhood. Good schools nearby. Juliana's breath caught. I can't accept. You can. Adriano looked back at her. And you will. For them. Then he was gone. Juliana stood in the middle of the room, clutching the business card, tears pouring down her face. Behind her, Chloe's small voice said, Mama, why are you crying? Juliana turned and pulled both girls into her arms. Because we're safe now, she whispered. We're finally safe. 2 days had passed since Adriano Silva walked out of room 212. 2 days of Juliana waking up in a real bed, feeding her daughters real meals, watching them laugh without looking over her shoulder. 2 days of slowly believing that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was actually over. She stood at the window now, watching Chloe and Palmer play in the small courtyard behind the inn. Snow had fallen again during the night, and the twins were building a lopsided snowman, their laughter carrying up to the 2nd floor. Real laughter. The kind that came from children who felt safe. Juliana pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging it slightly. She hadn't seen Adriano since that morning, but she'd seen his men, different ones each day, always at a distance, always watching. They never approached, never spoke to her, just existed on the periphery of her new life like silent guardians. It should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like breathing for the first time in months. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Juliana's shoulders tensed automatically, old habits dying hard, but when she checked the peephole, she found Rico again. She opened the door. Mrs. Molina. He held out a set of keys. The apartment is ready. Juliana stared at the keys like they might bite her. Already? Mr. Silva doesn't waste time. Rico's expression was professionally neutral. It's furnished. Utilities are on. Refrigerator is stocked. The girls' room has bunk beds and toys. Juliana's throat tightened. He thought of everything. He always does. Rico placed the keys in her hand. The address is on the tag. Whenever you're ready to move in, someone will help you with your things. I don't have things, Juliana said quietly. Everything I own fits in one bag. Rico's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then someone will help you carry your bag. He turned to leave, then paused. Mrs. Molina, Mr. Silva wanted me to tell you something. What? He said to remind you that protection isn't charity. It's correction. Rico's eyes met hers. You didn't do anything wrong. You're not taking advantage. You're just being taken care of, the way you should have been from the beginning. Before Juliana could respond, he was gone. She stood in the doorway, keys digging into her palm, and realized she was crying again. They moved into the apartment that afternoon. It was on the 3rd floor of a well-maintained building in a neighborhood Juliana had only driven through, before the kind of neighborhood with trees lining the streets and children playing on sidewalks and Christmas decorations that looked expensive. The kind of neighborhood where people like her didn't belong. Except now she did. Rico carried her single duffel bag up the stairs while Juliana held Chloe and Palmer's hands. When he unlocked the door and pushed it open, the twins gasped. The apartment was beautiful. Not extravagant, not ostentatious, just warm. A living room with a comfortable couch and a TV. A kitchen with a full-size refrigerator humming softly. 2 bedrooms, one with a double bed and dresser, the other with pink bunk beds and a toy chest overflowing with dolls and stuffed animals. Chloe and Palmer ran to their room, squealing with delight. Juliana stood frozen in the entryway. "This is too much," she whispered. Rico set her bag down by the couch. "Mr. Silva disagrees, but I can't." "You can." Rico's voice was firm but not unkind. "And you will. Because those girls deserve stability, and you deserve peace." He walked to the door, then stopped. "There's one more thing." He gestured to a small security panel by the entrance. "This is connected directly to our network. If you ever feel unsafe, if anything happens, you press that button. Someone will be here in under 3 minutes." Juliana stared at the panel. You're watching the apartment?" "Always." Rico's expression was matter of fact. "Mr. Silva takes care of what's his. But we're not. You are now." And then he left, closing the door softly behind him. Juliana stood in the middle of her new living room, listening to her daughters laugh in the next room, and felt the weight of 6 months slowly lifting from her shoulders. That night, after the twins were asleep in their new bunk beds, Juliana sat on her own bed and pulled out the business card Adriano had given her. A single phone number. No name, no company, just a lifeline. She ran her thumb over the embossed numbers, thinking about the man who had given it to her. A criminal, a man of violence, someone whose very name made grown men go silent with fear. And yet, he'd saved her. Not because he wanted something from her, not because he expected gratitude or loyalty or anything in return, but because he remembered what it was like to watch his mother suffer. Juliana closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet room, "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, insufficient, but they were all she had. Across the city, in an office that overlooked the darkened streets, Adriano Silva sat behind a desk covered with files. Files on Gregor and Tommy. Files on every other rogue collector operating in his territory. Files on widows and single mothers who had been terrorized, robbed, destroyed. He'd been working for 48 hours straight. Rico entered without knocking. "She's settled in. The girls are happy. No problems." Adriano nodded once, not looking up from the papers. "And the others?" Rico asked carefully. "The other collectors?" "Being handled." Adriano's voice was cold. "Every widow gets restitution. Every illegal debt gets canceled. Every man who participated gets a choice. Make it right, or disappear. Some of them won't choose wisely." "I know." Adriano finally looked up, his eyes hard and merciless. "That's their problem, not mine." Rico hesitated. "Boss, what you're doing for her. For Juliana. It's more than correction. You know that, right?" Adriano was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When I was a boy, I watched my mother beg men like Gregor and Tommy for mercy. I watched her cry. I watched her break. And I couldn't do anything to stop it." His hands curled into fists on the desk. "I swore I'd never be powerless again. That if I ever had the ability to stop men like that, I would, no matter what it cost." "And Juliana?" Juliana reminded me why I made that promise. Adriano's voice was quiet but absolute. "She's not charity. She's not a debt. She's proof that the promise still matters." Rico nodded slowly. "The men are asking questions. About why you're protecting a widow. About what she means to you. Let them ask." Adriano's eyes were cold. "And if anyone has a problem with it, they can bring it to me directly." No one would. They all knew better. Rico turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, boss, I think you did the right thing." Adriano didn't respond. He just returned to his files, working through the night, ensuring that every woman Gregor and Tommy had destroyed would be made whole again. Because power without purpose was just cruelty. And Adriano Silva refused to be cruel. Not to people who couldn't fight back. Not to mothers protecting their children. Not to women who reminded him of the one person he'd failed to save. His own mother, who had died when he was 15. Still afraid. Still in debt. Still broken. He couldn't save her. But he could save Juliana. And that would have to be enough. Spring arrived, tentative and soft. painting the city in shades of green and pale pink. Juliana stood at the window of her small, sunlit apartment, watching as Chloe and Palmer played hopscotch on the sidewalk below. Their laughter, bright and unburdened, floated up through the open window like music. She could still hardly believe it. 3 months had passed since that frozen Christmas Eve. 3 months of safety, 3 months of slow, steady breaths. The apartment was Adriano's doing, but it felt like hers. It was modest, a 2-bedroom on a quiet street, but it was clean, warm, and, most importantly, theirs. The security panel by the door glowed with a soft green light, a silent promise that had, over time, become a comfort rather than a reminder of fear. Juliana had found work, not under the table cleaning, but a real job with a real paycheck at a florist shop 2 blocks away. Mrs. Gable, the elderly owner, had taken one look at Juliana's careful hands and tired but determined eyes and hired her on the spot. "You have the look of someone who understands how precious, fragile things are," she'd said. The twins had started school. On their first day, they'd clung to Juliana's legs, their faces pale with anxiety born from too many sudden moves in the night. But by the afternoon, they'd returned with construction paper drawings and stories about a nice teacher named Miss Amy. Now, they chattered about friends and homework, their world expanding beyond the 4 walls of fear they'd lived in for so long. It was a normal life, a precious, ordinary life, and it was built on a foundation of quiet, unseen protection. Juliana never saw Adriano, but she felt his presence in the stability of her days. Rico appeared once a month, always on a Tuesday morning, to deliver an envelope. It was never cash. It was a grocery store gift card, a prepaid utility bill, a voucher for children's clothes. "Mr. Silva's investments yield dividends," Rico would say in his flat, polite tone. "He insists they be shared." At first, Juliana had tried to refuse. "I can't keep taking this. I have a job now." Rico had simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The debt was never yours, Mrs. Molina. This isn't repayment, it's restoration. Let him do this." So she did, and with each passing week, the knot of terror in her chest loosened another degree. One evening, as she was helping Palmer with her reading, a news segment flickered on the TV in the background. The polished anchor spoke in grave tones about a significant restructuring within certain undisclosed business sectors and a crackdown on predatory lending practices. The report was vague, citing unnamed sources, but it mentioned that several individuals had left the city abruptly. Juliana's hand stilled on Palmer's book. She didn't need names. She knew. Later, putting the girls to bed, Chloe looked up at her, her blue eyes serious. "Mama, he's just a man who remembers what it's like when people are cruel, and he decided to stop it." That night, after the twins were asleep, Juliana took out the simple business card Adriano had given her. She'd never used the number, but she kept it in her jewelry box, a talisman of a night when the world had split in two, the before and the after. She thought of him then, not as the imposing Mafia boss who silenced rooms, but as the boy he'd once been. A boy who watched his mother break, a man who had built a kingdom of fear, only to use its walls to shelter a stranger and her children from the storm. It was a contradiction she could not reconcile, so she had stopped trying. Some debts were not meant to be balanced on a ledger. Some were settled in the quiet of a safe home, in the sound of children sleeping deeply, in the simple act of a mother not having to look over her shoulder. She walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful street. A black sedan was parked under a street lamp 2 blocks down. It was always there, a different one, in a different spot, but always present. She no longer felt a chill when she saw it. Instead, she felt a profound, humbling gratitude. Adriano Silva had not given her charity. He had given her back her life, and in doing so, he had rebuilt something in himself. Not redemption, perhaps, but a fragment of the boy who had been powerless, now wielding his power with a purpose that was, in its own stark way, a form of mercy. Juliana placed her palm against the cool glass. Somewhere in the city, he was moving through shadows, enforcing his brutal code. But because of that code, her daughters were coloring at the kitchen table. Because of his rules, she could plan for a future. The nightmare was over. Morning had come, and the man who lived in the dark had been the one to turn on the light. 5 Christmases later, the diner was gone. In its place stood a sleek, glass-fronted cafe. Juliana paused on the sidewalk, her gloved hands holding tightly to 2 larger, warmer ones. Chloe and Palmer, now 10, buzzed with pre-holiday energy, their breaths making plumes in the cold air. "It looks different," Palmer said, her voice no longer a whisper but clear and bright. Everything looks different when you're not scared, Chloe stated, wise beyond her years. Juliana squeezed their hands. They'd made this pilgrimage every Christmas Eve, not out of debt, but remembrance. Their life was wonderfully, beautifully ordinary. The apartment had become a home filled with school projects, too loud music, and the comfortable clutter of a family. Juliana managed the florist shop now, and the scent of pine and cinnamon from the holiday wreaths they'd made that morning still clung to her coat. They walked on, heading toward their tradition, hot chocolate at the fancy cafe that had replaced the diner. As they passed a newsstand, a headline on a financial magazine caught Juliana's eye. Silva Enterprises, the reclusive billionaire reshaping cities. Below the text was a photograph grainy, taken from a distance of a man in a dark overcoat getting into a car. Adriano, older, his hair shot with silver at the temples, his expression as impassive and controlled as ever. To the world, he was a legend, wrapped in shadow, a billionaire philanthropist with rumored, darker roots, a man who commanded boardrooms and, whispers insisted, still commanded fear. To Juliana, he was the silence that had fallen over a diner, the weight of a gaze that had seen her suffering and refused to look away. The reason her daughters knew safety as a birthright, not a miracle. "You okay, Mama?" Palmer asked, following her gaze to the magazine. "I'm perfect," Juliana said, and meant it. They settled into a booth at the cafe, the ghost of that corner booth 5 years gone beneath their feet. As the girls debated marshmallows versus whipped cream, Juliana's thoughts drifted. She had never called the number. But once, about 2 years ago, a crisis had found her. Not men with threats, but a flooded apartment from a burst pipe upstairs. As she stood amid the chaos, panicking about repairs and costs, a van had pulled up. A crew in unmarked uniforms had efficiently moved her belongings, handled the water extraction, and restored the apartment within days. The foreman had simply said, "Mr. Silva sends his regards." The invoice read, "Paid in full, debt, 0. That was his language. Not flowers or apologies, but concrete action. Protection, not charity. Correction. The hot chocolates arrived, decadent and topped with peaks of cream. As the girls laughed, Juliana looked out the window at the bustling festive street. The fear was a memory now, a scar that had healed strong. The man who had ended her nightmare lived on in the peace of her present. Across the city, in a penthouse office that overlooked the glittering skyline, Adriano Silva stood at the window. The festive lights below meant nothing to him. Holidays were just another day in the architecture of control he had built. Rico entered, older too, a few more lines around his eyes. "The annual report on the Molina family," he said, placing a single sheet of paper on the desk. "All indicators positive. Health, education, financial stability. No external threats detected." Adriano didn't turn. He already knew. The reports were a formality, a ritual. "Good. She still works at the flower shop. She was promoted. The girls are in a gifted program. They went to the old diner site today. It's a cafe now." A faint, almost imperceptible nod. The ghost of a memory flickered a woman in a worn olive jacket, her eyes holding a universe of despair, 2 small birds huddled under her wings. He had not done it for gratitude. He had done it because the world had rules, and the strongest rule was this: the powerful decide who suffers. That night, he had simply decided that she would not anymore. It was the correction of an ancient, personal wrong, a balance struck across the ledger of his own haunted past. "Is there anything else, boss?" Rico asked. "No." Adriano's voice was the same low, quiet baritone that could silence a room. "That's all." Rico left. Adriano remained at the window, a silhouette against the city's glow. His empire was vast, built on a foundation that was both legitimate and brutal. He was not a good man. He knew the cost of his power, measured in secrets and shadows. But in a small, warm cafe across town, a woman sipped hot chocolate with her daughters. They laughed without looking at the door. They planned for tomorrow without fear. They were whole. And for a man who had spent a lifetime building fortresses, that knowledge was a singular, quiet triumph. He had not saved his mother. He could not erase the boy's shame or the man's sins. But he had stopped the cycle. Once. For one family, on one Christmas Eve, he had been the wall against the darkness. It was not redemption. Redemption was for simpler men, with cleaner souls. It was something else, a testament, proof that even in the coldest heart, in the most calculated kind of power, a line could be drawn. That mercy could be a weapon, and protection could be the most ruthless decision of all. Outside Juliana's cafe, snow began to fall, covering the city in a soft, silent blanket. It covered the old scars, the memories of running, the ghost of hunger. It covered everything, making the world new again. Juliana gathered her girls, their cheeks flushed with warmth and joy. As they stepped out into the sparkling night, she didn't glance back. She looked forward, toward home, toward the future. The night that had begun with fear had ended with a different legacy, not of debt or violence, but of a quiet, unbreakable safety. A gift from a monster who knew what monsters did, and chose, for one moment, to be something else. That night, the Mafia boss didn't destroy a life. He ended a nightmare. And in the silence that followed, a family learned how to live. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.